Well, I am very excited to have Amanda Kippert here on the podcast. Amanda, how are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing good. So I was trying to think back to when you and I first connected, and I think it was you're still writing for Domestic Shelter, correct?
Yes. I'm the
How's that?
editorial director there, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. Say that again.
I'm the editorial director of Domestic Shelters. So I do all the content for it. It's a national domestic violence website. But yeah, I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago that I first.
But you went to school to be a journalist.
I did.
And then how did that transition from, obviously you're still a journalist, you're still a writer, you have a new podcast out, you do public speaking as well. But how did the domestic violence component become such an important influence in your work?
Sure. I started out in daily newspapers back in my early 20s before people stopped reading them. But I always wanted to do nonprofit work. That's always been a passion of mine. I've always wanted to work for a company that does good things, for the world, as dreamy and altruistic as that sounds. But so when I got married at 30, and I married someone who was in the military, and so then they started moving us around, I became a freelancer. And the former CEO of the company I used to work for started this nonprofit website called Domestic Shelters, and he called me up and asked if I would do the content for it. So maybe he had heard me get up on a soapbox about domestic violence or something at some point. And so that's kind of how I got hooked up with that. And I've been writing about domestic violence for the last 7 years, nonstop, which has been such an immersive education in the topic.
Absolutely. Now, I know you wrote that big HuffPo piece. Was it last year? On the concern with domestic violence in the military?
It actually came out at the very end of 2019.
Right. And then was the influence of that article, did that stem from some of your exposure with your husband having been in the military to some of the systemic issues that are surrounding that concern?
Right. Yeah, a little bit, because actually it was from writing a story for Domestic Shelters about survivors of abuse who had military spouses. And after I wrote this initial article, a lot of military spouses reached out to me and said, the military doesn't actually help us. They're not actually being supportive. And when we've reported abuse, it doesn't seem like they care. Which really surprised me, because as a military spouse, I haven't been on that side of things, but I would have assumed that the military would have been supportive and taken the right actions. So it kind of shocked me a little bit. And so I started talking to more military spouses, survivors, and just dozens of them called, emailed, found me somehow. And I started interviewing them, and they all had a similar story, which was, I've been abused, I reported it to their commander, and nothing's being done. So it evolved into this big story, and 2 other reporters joined me, Tara Hale and Melissa Jeltsin from the Huffington Post. And then we created this huge package over a year-long period that came out at the end of 2019 that told all these women's stories, and then told about what the military is not exactly doing to help them.
No, I thought it was a fascinating piece. I was rereading it a day or two ago, and especially one of the key takeaways being that the military is much more focused on infidelity than they are on spousal abuse or intimate partner violence. And it is a rampant problem. Like, I remember being in basic training, and one of my drill sergeants would come in every morning or every afternoon and be like, "You're the reason I beat my wife. You're the reason I beat my kids." And it was just such a toxic description of his home life that he blamed on us to then take out that frustration on his wife and kids. And I think that there is just this, I don't want to say a culture of toxicity in the military, but there's almost a cognitive dissonance between having someone be so violent and assertive towards one group of people, but then an inability to rechannel that rage and frustration when they come home, and dealing with those challenges and those frustrations and that emotional angst in more appropriate ways, which are a completely different coping skill than how you would apply them on the battlefield.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of education of commanders and supervisors in the military to recognize these kinds of differences and say that, the way that we might promote violence as a military tactic is not necessarily something you need to take home. And
Right.
here are reasons why, and this is how it escalates. And, I think the biggest thing is, and even talking to my husband about it, who's an officer, and saying, he told me that when people come to him and there's like an issue or a problem, you sit down with usually it's a guy, and you say, this is what I see and this is what we need to correct. But with domestic violence, it's such a different thing that you can't do that. You can't respond like that, because sitting the guy down and telling him, and he might be in trouble is actually going to have such negative consequences for the victim. When he goes back home and says, you got me in trouble, you told on me.
Right. Well, not only that, but it is such a closed environment. Like so many, I mean, this from your, being married to a soldier, Army, Marines, Navy. What is your, Air Force, Airman? Is that the correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Being married to an airman, like you understand, like you're always traveling, which means you may not be near your family, and your other support, your close-knit support network is often other spouses. Your kids aren't going to public schools; they're pretty much going to schools that are on base, and you're away from your family and your friends who would be able to tell that this you isn't the old you, and can pick up on those pre-incident indicators, or those indicators that are self-evident of, intimate partner violence in the household.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So when your article came out, did you notice any, did you get any pushback from the military, or were any, Congress people or senators or representatives reaching out on a platform that could, hopefully inspire real change?
No, I wish I did. I wish it would have gotten a big response. I wish it would have made someone in those ranks pay attention, but I did not personally hear anything. As far as I know, the Huffington Post didn't hear anything to that effect. The military was very succinct in their answers about their response to domestic violence. The only thing we could get out of them was, we respond to it appropriately, to that effect.
Well, I mean, the military historically has had an absolutely horrific track record. I mean, the very first podcast I ever did was on the Vanessa Guillen incident. I'm sorry, the Vanessa Guillen tragedy, where she was being sexually harassed and abused by a coworker and was ultimately killed by that same soldier. And for months after, the military was denying any knowledge of inappropriateness or misconduct on behalf of the soldier. And so I can only imagine that extends far and wide through this like systemic culture that the military is always trying to keep under wraps.
I think so, because I don't want to speak for them, but I would assume that there's a lot to do there, having to do with the mission coming first, and that's the most important thing. And so it's felt to me a little bit like a domestic violence issue is more of a PR problem than a women's safety problem.
Well, also it hurts recruitment efforts. It hurts, the morale. It hurts I mean, and what most people, I think, sometimes fail to realize is that when they think of the military, they think of, like the guys, that like I was, like an actual, a soldier in the most, understood sense of that term, gun, uniform, on the front line. But the reality is that for every one, quote unquote shooter, there's 9 support personnel behind that person, everyone from finance to mechanics to transportation and that, while the infantry or the special operations community may be, predominantly male, the rest of the military is, as diverse as, most workplaces would be today. Certain, maybe the medical fields or the nursing fields are a little more, leveraged towards women, but the rest of I would say the military is probably a 70-30 split, which I would say most of the workforce is today. I mean, I don't know if I have those numbers exactly correct, but it's It's a real issue. And then how has that all, transitioning out of like the military concern to the civilian concern
Yeah.
with COVID seeing an unprecedented spike in cases of domestic violence? Are you seeing those trend lines in the usage rate of your website, or people reaching out for support, or resources being called on? What are you seeing on your end as how COVID is impacting the domestic violence concern?
Sure. I mean, we have definitely heard from advocates that are both part of domesticshelters.org, because we're the largest, we're actually like the only comprehensive directory online of domestic violence shelters throughout the United States and Canada. And so we've heard from advocates that calls to their emergency helplines have shot up over the last year. And a lot of that has to do with the quarantine aspect and also the stress aspect. If you have an abuser and a victim, and the abuser is typically going to work on a daily basis, the amount of time that they are home to be abusive is less. So obviously it's not rocket science, but when you quarantine
Right.
an abuser and a victim together, there's going to be a lot more time for those abusive incidents to occur. And then just compounded with all the stress of the last year. Stress doesn't cause abuse, but stress definitely perpetuates abuse. So for all those reasons, it has definitely gone up.
Right. And one of the things that I strive for this podcast to provide is, when confronted by these challenges or these harmful incidents or these risk indicators, the protective strategies that you can employ to succeed in staying safe. And so while the victims, who are the individuals who are being abused themselves, have one set of resources available to them, what are some of the things that friends, family, colleagues, coworkers who may suspect that an individual is being abused, what are some of the steps that they can take to, allow that individual to know that they are a framework of support for them, but also not make, how do they help without making things worse for that person who's being impacted?
I think one of the most common mistakes that a lot of support people make, and their heart's in the right place, but they just don't know, is that they tell the survivor to leave. Just get out right away, leave that person. They're being abusive, go. And then the second mistake is typically, let me call the police, or you should call the police. And I'm not saying that the police aren't supportive, but these two things, leaving and calling law enforcement, should always be a survivor's choice, because they don't know, the support person doesn't know if it's safe to do these things, and only the survivor/victim knows that. So I think as a support person, if someone discloses abuse to you, the number one thing is just to listen and to believe them first and foremost, and not question them. Are you sure? Are you sure that's what happened? Just listening and be supportive can be like the number one best thing. And then secondly, ask them what they need. What can I do to support you right now? Maybe they just want to talk about it. Maybe they want to understand it more, in which case, definitely a site like domesticshelters.org, which has over 500 articles outlining all the different facets of abuse, can help them to understand what they're going through, because sometimes abuse doesn't always look like getting hit. Sometimes it looks like control, and sometimes it looks like possessiveness.
Right.
It can be gaslighting, it can be psychological abuse. So helping
emotional, financial, there's more abuse than just physical violence.
Right. And then once they understand, more so what they're going through, they know that they're not alone, because they can see all these other people are going through it. Then they might be ready to take the next steps, which is possibly leaving, possibly getting an order of protection. But it has to be done carefully, because impulsive choices when you are with an abuser is the thing that can get you, into a lot of trouble in terms of violence, possibly even homicide.
That's true. And I think another component is for people to understand that, there are the 4 personality types of the fight, the flight, the freeze, and the fawn. And I think a lot of us like to identify ourselves as being either fight or flight. But if the reality is that most people are freeze or fawn, and that reality, when you are confronted with that, that situational violence, and you are freezing or you are in a state of fawn, and that comes as such a shock to you because you never understood yourself to be someone in that in that framework of understanding because of whatever childhood trauma or, stressors that you experienced as a child, you are much more likely to make decisions that are in line with victimhood. I'm not saying that you are a victim, but the decisions that you would make are more in line with that. And I think the more that people understand that that is not an inhibitor to your success to leave, it's just another obstacle that you need to overcome in your escape plan, or in your plan to leave, or in your survival planning, is a very important component to ensuring the certainty of your safety as you do try to leave. Because, as I'm sure you know, the most deadly time for someone who is involved in intimate partner violence is when they try to leave, because that is when the abuser will almost always escalate the violence to regain and reassert their level of control. Yeah,
absolutely. And any advocate would back that up. It's definitely the most dangerous time. That's why it needs to be done carefully, with consideration. And I'm not saying that if you are in immediate danger, of course, you need to run out of the house, call 911. But if it's a situation where you have a little bit of time to plan, it's better to get all your kind of ducks in a row. And the best way to do that, honestly, is to call a domestic violence advocate at your local hotline, because they can walk you through a safety plan. We have safety plan information on domestic shelters. There's even like a DIY safety plan worksheet that you can fill out. And it just says, if the abuser does this, here's what you're going to do. And then,
like an if this, then that. That's great.
Right. So that you're prepared, for anything that they can throw at you. You know what your next step is going to be. You don't have that, hopefully you don't have that like freeze instinct kicked in.
And I'll link the website to domestic shelters down in the show notes below. But is there also a specific section on the website where the local resources are made available? So here if you live in Austin, here are some resources. If you live in Spokane, Washington, if you live in Chicago, if you live in DC, if you live in Atlanta.
Right. At the very top of the page, it just says find help. Click on that, enter your zip code, and all your local shelters will pop up. I think a big misnomer for people is that you would call a shelter if you're looking for shelter, but actually you call a shelter, they all have hotlines. You can talk to them just about what's going on. You can talk to them about safety plan. You can talk to them about how you want to leave. You can ask them if they have local legal resources to help you file an order of protection. So it's definitely not, you don't have to be looking for shelter to call a shelter hotline.
That's great. And then I want to get you out of here talking about your podcast, Toxic. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. It actually just launched on Monday. So
I know, I was very excited when you sent the link. I'm already subscribing.
Thanks. Yeah, 3 days in. I wanted to launch this, actually. I wanted to do this for a long time. I've been thinking about doing, because I'm a fan of true crime, and I like listening to true crime podcasts. And I don't want to take stories of domestic violence and make them into entertainment or sensationalize them. But I think that telling survivors' stories, and more importantly, telling stories of these abusers and what they have been allowed to get away with, is a way to raise awareness that's not so sort of textbook and static. I think there's a way to both entertain people and educate them. And I've always been a big believer in telling interesting stories that have a purpose. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with this. So my best friend, Jenna Brandel, and I launched it with the intent to sort of do that, to entertain, but also to say, here's this guy, and here's what he's doing, and here's the facets of toxic masculinity that play into it. Here's how to recognize it and hopefully avoid it.
That's great. I'm really looking forward to listening to this. And then if people want to learn more about you or your work, what's the best place for them to find you online?
Sure. I have a website, amandakippert.com, or I would just say toxicthepodcast.com is where you can go to learn more about the stories we're telling there. Those are 2 spots you can find me.
Great. Is that your dog barking or mine?
That's my dog barking.
All right. Just wasn't sure. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you go take care of your pup. I got to go let mine out too.
Okay.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Cheers.